Hey there, students. Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to another audio-visual lecture. This time we're going to talk about a really touchy, sensitive topic, and that is bullying. You hear a lot about this in the media, people talking about it, and it turns out that there are some really kind of hardcore consequences revolving around bullying, unfortunately. So we're going to take a look at those. We're going to look at some research and discuss a really just sort of difficult topic to kind of talk about, as many people have been exposed or involved in something that we know is bullying. So let's go to our slides here, and then we'll kind of kick it off from there. Okay, so let's talk about bullying. Sorry, I skipped my slide there. Anyway, so it turns out when it comes to bullying, it is surprisingly common. We're going to look at some numbers with that, but it turns out that it is pretty prevalent in our society, unfortunately, that a lot of people experience this growing up, and even other ages as well. We know that it is related to several negative outcomes. Unfortunately, some of these outcomes that we're going to discuss are more short-term. However, some of them are more long-term, and some of them are surprisingly long-term. So we're going to find that it does leave some lasting impressions and consequences, unfortunately. There are different types of bullying. So we have, like physical, kind of like beating kids up, that kind of thing, or teasing them emotionally, rumors, for example, but also cyberbullying, which a lot of you have probably heard of before, where it's taking place through a screen, a computer screen, online, and so forth. So we're going to look at that as well. All right, so let's look at some numbers. So before we get to the graph here, we said that it's surprisingly common. So we're going to look at a study. This was by Nansel and others in 2001, and they found that approximately 1/3 of 6th to 10th graders, so 1/3 of grades 6 through 10, experienced occasional or frequent bullying, either as a victim or as a perpetrator. So in other words, about 1/3 of kids around 6th to 10th grade are involved in bullying in some capacity, whether they are the bullies themselves or the victims of bullies, unfortunately. So, wow, if you think about that, 1/3 of kids in that age range, that's a huge, huge number. So we know that it's pretty prevalent, and it's pretty, unfortunately, it's pretty common in our society. All right, so next we're going to look at some more research here. So this is bullying behaviors among US youth. So this is some research presented in our textbook that I want to show you. And it kind of goes over the different types of bullying, some things that kids have reported that they've been bullied involving these things, okay? So keep in mind, this is based on self-report. So in other words, the subjects in the study reported this data, and it's the percent of experiencing bullying based on what they found, the percent of bullying, that they found in the study, okay? So let's just look at some examples. What's interesting about this is that they've also broken it up in male and female. So we're going to take a look at that. It's important to kind of note that. So our first one here, being belittled about religion or race. So they found that males reported that more, okay? So approximately, what is that, about 8% or so. The next category is being belittled about looks or speech. Notice the numbers are much higher in that category. And when we look at this one, females slightly edged the males. So more females are reporting that they were bullied over something like this, about how they look or how they talk, for example. So more girls and boys are reporting that, but it's very comparable. Being hit, slapped, or pushed. So once again, this one shows a big difference in the genders. So more males are reporting that. Being the subject of rumors. So more females. Once again, it's pretty close here, but females are reporting that they were exposed to that more slightly. Okay, and then the last one, subject of sexual comments or gestures. And so there's a big difference here that about over 20% of females reported this. So as you can see, it's kind of an interesting data set here where you see the different categories and what those are, but also how it's a little bit different between boys and girls, or if it is different, that kind of thing. So I thought that was interesting. All right, let's continue on and look at some more research here. When we look at the data overall, we find that boys are more likely to be the bullies. Now, that doesn't mean that girls can't do that, because obviously that happens. But if we look at the raw data, we find that boys are more likely to be bullies. When it comes to being a victim, it seems to be less clear. And as we saw in that graph a little bit earlier, it's not as clear cut as saying it's only boys that are the victims or girls, for example. It kind of depends on what type of bullying we're talking about. And so there's other variables in play as well. So it's less clear in terms of who's actually being the victim. All right, continuing on. Bullies are more likely to have low grades and to smoke or drink. So in other words, people that are bullying others are the ones that are probably not doing well in school. You know, if we look at the numbers, on average, they tend to be doing poorly in school, but also more prone to say some of the risky behaviors, such as smoking and drinking as a minor in this particular example. All right, so victims are more likely to be socially withdrawn and aggressive. So I thought this was kind of an interesting finding. So victims are more likely to be socially withdrawn. So in other words, I think what the point here is that maybe the reason they're a target of being bullied is because they're being viewed as less threatening. In other words, I can push this person around, I can be mean to them, but they're not going to retaliate in any way, and thus it's safe for me to do so. It's kind of a safe target, even though it's completely wrong, obviously, but it's a safe target to be able to get away with this. So when I read that in the textbook and thought about that, I immediately thought back to high school, my own experiences, not that I was bullied or a bully or anything like that, but I remember one particular peer, and we'll just call him Billy, just for, you know, confidentiality reasons. And I remember Billy being really just, you know, bullied by other kids, left and right. You know, he was kind of short, he was overweight, he was really socially awkward. And I think a lot of people viewed him as this easy target to get out aggression and get out, you know, anger or whatever it was that they were trying to do on this poor kid. And I just remember like just feeling so sad and so sorry for this poor guy, Billy, who really didn't do anything wrong. He was just a little weird, a little bit different than other people, certainly didn't deserve that in any way. But I just kind of remember him feeling, you know, kind of fitting that description of being a little bit socially withdrawn, awkward in that sense, and just unfortunately was a target for many people. Research also shows that victims are often aggressive. So I thought that was an interesting one. You wouldn't think that. And so the rationale here is that maybe the reason they're being bullied is because they're irritating. So if you think about people that you grew up with that are aggressive and just sort of push the limits a little too much, that probably pushed people's buttons and, you know, irritated people. And maybe that's why they were getting bullied. I mean, I'm just sort of speculating here. That's not always the case, obviously. But if we look at the research, it's showing that a lot of kids who are viewed as aggressive by others tend to be a target of bullying. So I thought that was interesting. They've also found that people that are bullied are often in the same classroom as those that, you know, with their bullies. So in other words, what that's sort of saying is that it's someone you probably know, and it's someone that you probably see like on a daily basis. And so it's someone you're familiar with. It's not some stranger that kind of comes up to you. It's more someone that you well know. You see them on a daily basis, like we said, and unfortunately you're exposed to that person. Okay, so next we're going to go to the consequences of bullying. And unfortunately, there are some very hardcore consequences associated with bullying. And this is why we're concerned. We want to avoid these. We don't want kids to experience any of these in any capacity. So you have to realize as we go through these findings that we're saying that bullied children, you know, the victims of bullying are more likely to experience these compared to kids who are not bullied, okay? So remember, in no way am I saying that being bullied causes you to be this person or anything like that. It's correlational data. And remember, we're comparing it to kids who have never been bullied or not bullied, that kind of thing. So please keep that in mind as we kind of go through the data here. All right, so they found that they're more likely to be depressed, which kind of makes sense if you're being belittled and picked on a consistent basis. That's got to hit home emotionally for that person. So you can see why internally they would maybe kind of feel that way. It's linked to suicide ideation. What that basically means is they've been thinking about committing suicide, possibly even creating a plan to do so. So the point, it's in their mind that they're considering committing suicide. In fact, we know based on research that they're more likely to attempt suicide compared to kids who are not bullied. Having excess weight. So this one you got to be really careful with. So we're going to be very careful when we approach this one. What the research is basically showing is that kids who are bullied around age 6, which is showing it's happening very early, age 6 meaning are in first grade or so, are the ones that tend to have excess weight when they get to 12 or 13. So if they're bullied around age 6, we find that there's a good chance that they will have excess weight by the time they're 12, 13, going into middle school, for example. So it's not necessarily that they were heavy to begin with, or that's why they're being picked on. I'm not saying that, but for whatever reason, we know there's a connection, some kind of correlation to that. We also know that bullying is associated with relationship problems, okay? So research shows that they may have difficulty forming lasting relationships or to get along with their coworkers. So this is kind of showing the long-term effects of bullying. If you guys remember, we mentioned that there's short-term and long-term. So this is the long-term. So we know that people that were bullied, possibly when they were younger, once they become an adult, it may be hard for them to relate to people or to form relationships with their coworkers. In other words, they may be distant. Now remember, many things could cause that. I'm not just saying bullying is, the culprit here, but once again, when we compare it to kids who have not bullied, we see greater numbers. And so we think that there may be a connection there. We know it's connected to mental health issues. We already said depression was one of them, but other mental health problems are also connected to being bullied. So interestingly, the textbook talks about agoraphobia. So if you're not familiar with that, it's obviously a phobia, agoraphobia. And the essence of that is being sort of frightful of being in public places. So it may be something about being bullied that makes you uncomfortable about being outside your home and being out in public, for example. And you can kind of see how there may be a connection there. By the way, these mental health issues seem to kind of come out in our early to mid 20s. So there, once again, another long-term connection to people who are being bullied when they're young, to having problems when they become an adult. Keep in mind, some of these problems have been connected 5 decades later. So wow, long-term, big time. So in other words, we know that people were bullied when they were a child. It may be as much as 50 years later that they're still experiencing some of these problems. That shows it has lasting effects. It's not just something that you could, quickly get over. I mean, I guess that could happen, but some people dwell on it, or it continues to affect them on a daily basis, or a consistent basis, I should say. And in some cases, 5 decades. So I thought that was really, really just alarming and just shocking to think about that. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about cyberbullying. So obviously this is, bullying through the internet and different platforms and things like that. So we know that's linked to stress. It's also linked to suicide ideation. Okay, so once again, even if you're not even around the person, you're communicating through a screen, we know that can create problems as well. The studies are showing that cyberbullying is more linked to suicide ideation compared to traditional bullying. Wow, that's a really interesting finding, that it's even more so linked compared to the traditional bullying in person. So wow, really interesting finding there. All right, so this will sort of conclude our short lecture on bullying. It's obviously a subject really important to be aware of out there, because we know a lot of kids are being exposed to that. A lot of people have problems with that. So hopefully you've learned something, and think about that as you progress through the course and of course through your life. All right, so that will conclude the lecture, guys. Please progress to the next step in the class.